Okay. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. We have a very, very rich conversation today. One that I know is on TK Smith and Brittany Webb's minds continuously as they do their work in life. First, I want to thank our sponsors for Art at Noon. The Art at Noon lectures are supported by the Lefkoe family in memory of a beloved member of the docent corps, Mildred T. Lefkoe. Before we begin our conversation today, I want to promote two upcoming programs. For those folks who live in Philadelphia, this Saturday, we've invited archivist Kellen Baldridge Smallwood back to lead a behind-the-scenes tour and conversation about the year-long project of processing, preserving, and digitizing the John Rhoden collection. Tour participants will be able to view objects from the Rhoden's archive, learn about PAFA's archives and collections, and tour our archives vault. It'll be an exciting Saturday, so I'll add the registration link in the chat. And our next Art at Noon is March 6th and features Karen Lemmy, the Lucy S. Ram Curator of Sculpture at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and Grace Yasamura, the inaugural Luce Foundation Curatorial Fellow and Assistant Curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Their conversation will focus on their exhibition, The Shape of Power, Stories of Race and American Sculpture. I'll also put that link in the chat so you can register for that upcoming Art at Noon. Now it's time to start our program, and I want to introduce our two speakers. TK Smith is a curator, writer, and cultural historian. Currently, he is a doctoral student in the History of American Civilization program at the University of Delaware, where he researches art, material culture, and the built environment. He received his Master's of Arts in American Studies and his Bachelor of Arts in English and African American Studies with a certificate in creative writing from St. Louis University. He has written for Art in America, the Brooklyn Rail, and Art Papers, where he is a contributing editor. In 2021, he was invited to be the inaugural writer-in-residence at the Vashon Artist Residency, and in 2022, he was the recipient of an Andy Warhol Writers Grant for short-form writing. Smith was a Monument Labs 2022-2023 writer-in-residence, and most recently, Smith completed a curatorial residence on behalf of the Barnes Foundation at Yinka Shonabare's GAS residency in Lagos, Nigeria. Dr. Brittany Webb is the Evelyn and Will Kaplan Curator of 20th Century Art and the John Rhoden Collection at PAFA. Her most recent exhibition, Determined to Be, The Sculpture of John Rhoden, features 70 sculptures by artist John Rhoden, who lived from 1916 to 2001, and the exhibition is on view at PAFA through April 7th and is accompanied by a multi-authored catalog published in 2023 and distributed by the University of Washington Press. Before joining PAFA, Webb was a member of the curatorial staff of the African American Museum in Philadelphia. She holds a PhD from Temple University and a BA from the University of Southern California. Thank you so much, TK and Brittany. I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Lori. Thank you so much for those generous intros. Hi, TK. How are you?
Howdy, I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. I'm excited to get to talk about race and arts criticism, but I thought just to sort of give our participants the lay of the land that I would start off with slides. So hopefully you all don't mind indulging me in setting the stage a little bit.
Please.
Okay, so I thought it would be nice to start off by just thinking a little bit about Rhoden's career in the context of art criticism. I think that one of the things that's been exciting about this project, putting it together, is thinking about the importance of archives and the importance of Rhoden's press footprint, which was really extensive and was part of the catalog in a really important way. There's an excellent essay in the catalog by Rebecca Van Diver, who is an art historian who wrote about John Rhoden's coverage in the press. And one of the things that she lays out really well in this catalog is that media coverage of Rhoden is one lens into his practice that's really important because it gives us a sense of both the work that Rhoden was doing in the 1930s, 40s, 50s throughout his lifetime. It gives us a sense of who was interested in that work. The number of press outlets writing about that work is really vast and kind of important. He was covered by US newspapers and international outlets, by magazines and popular media, and in arts journals. And that's one way to understand what an artist is doing in the 20th century, and artists like Rhoden, and how people are writing about it, who is interested in that work at the time. And so you're seeing clips here. I wanted people to understand that his work was covered really broadly. So what we're looking at is slides of newspaper clippings that feature coverage of Rodin's artistic practice in the 1950s in newspapers in France, in Finland, and in the Korean Republic in Seoul. And one of the things that I think that is really key for laying that out is giving us a sense in this moment that the press coverage over his life was substantial, it was consistent, it was international. And it was something that was archived in a lot of places. This comes to us from the John Rhoden papers at PAFA, which we processed institutionally in 2019, between 2019 and 2021. But the thing that I'm always remembering as we process these objects is they're available for us because they're archived, right? Somebody had to save them over the course of a career. And Rhoden's art practice wasn't the only thing that was covered. His life was also a point of interest for media outlets. So you're looking here at a Newsday article that ran in 1966, in August of 1966. And the article is called "Century Old Garage Gets a New Life." And in this article, what's featured here is John and Rashonda Rhoden's home in Brooklyn Heights on Cranberry Street. And so you're looking at a photograph that ran with the article you can see on your screens. And we see John and Rashonda Rhoden, these artists, sitting in this Brooklyn house that they have renovated from a former garage. It had been a number of things, but when they renovated it to be their home studios, it also had this life that publics got to engage on a walking tour. And so this kind of coverage of their life is really great documentary evidence for us, but it also lets us know, oh, the press was interested in the sculpture practice of John, but also how people interacted with it. So you're seeing, I'm going to use the mouse to gesture here. You're seeing sculpture in the background here and in this brick wall here. Up against the wall, these are paintings by Rashonda. And because this was on a walking tour, we can understand that there was a public audience that they were nurturing beyond museums and galleries where Rodin sculpture was also shown, but it also included just everyday people who went on walking tours in the neighborhood. And one of the reasons I think this is really important is because Dr. Van Diver in the essay finds, and I'm going to quote here, just so I can be faithful to her scholarship, that the bulk of Rodin's press clippings comprises brief announcements of his exhibitions, group and individual exhibitions, prestigious fellowships, and public sculpture commissions. There's the occasional society page mention. By the 1950s and 60s, his international travels became another topic of interest. However, criticism of his art in print and beyond the odd evaluative statement remains elusive. And I think that's an important place for us to enter this conversation, where we're thinking about the importance of press coverage in general and arts criticism in particular, because I have TK and I talk about what art exhibition reviews do for an artist. And I had a former mentor who often said that exhibition reviews are a first draft of art history. And so it's interesting to think about who is crafting those drafts, and what happens when those first drafts aren't being crafted, or they're being crafted in a particular way because of the relationship that writers have to artists, and what does this look like for Black artists in the 20th century. And so now you're looking at a slide that features the gallery handout that came from John Rhoden's major survey show in his lifetime at the Birmingham Museum of Art in 1985. And we're also seeing an article by an art critic, James R. Nelson, that ran for that show. And one of the reasons that I think it's interesting is it's a critical review of the exhibition that also exists in the John Rhoden papers. And it's the kind of thing that is fascinating, not just because of what's in the article itself, but because the Rhodens kept it for so many decades after it ran. And so I'm going to read a clip of it here, just to sort of set another stage for us. So in this exhibition review, James Nelson wrote, quote, "Much of Rhoden's career, which continues with great force and panache, parallels these times. His work shows certain superficial similarities to that of many of the great names from the past 30 years. Virtually every piece in the show brings with it associations such as how like Jacques Lipchitz, or reminiscence of Henry Moore, or there is a Picasso like that. Perhaps this is the principal reason for Rhoden not being among the great names of the last 30 years. A fine craftsman, an artist of great curiosity, and a man of dedicated determination, he has produced works that are admirable, expressive, and valid. They are also essentially eclectic. This eclecticism is not bad. It simply limits Rhoden to that respectable rank just below greatness." And this is a fascinating, this is an end quote. That's a fascinating review of an exhibition, this rank just below greatness, and an article where Nelson also notes this mastery of materials that he sees in Rhoden's practice that's evident. And one of the things that I think of every time I looked at this article is this is not just a critical review, it's a sharp criticism that John and Rashonda kept. This is not just in the Rhoden papers, he laminated this. And thinking about the materiality of that, to get this in a newspaper, it's not a glowing review, but to cut it out and laminate it so that it's preserved in this pristine way tells us something about the importance of the review, even when it's not positive and glowing. And I thought this would be a nice place for us to start thinking about the importance of art criticism to our understanding of modern and contemporary art, and to also zoom out and think about the recent past and the contemporary present, right? I want us to meditate on whether we think the problems of the past persist into the present, and what the current landscape of arts criticism enables for Black artists or limits for them. And I've been thinking a bit with the way Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw distinguishes between the work that is art historical versus art critical. So in a new book called The Art of Remembering, Shaw elucidates the concepts of remembering and disremembering that I call from Toni Morrison, also informs the way that I see some of the differences between art history and art criticism. The historian of African American art writes about what was, effectively remembering the disremembered from the materials that have been purposefully undervalued and disregarded by white supremacist historians of American art. Whereas the critic of African American art has the latitude to focus on what is and what might have been, proposing new memories of Black artistic practices. And I really like that. I think it could be good for us to sort of sit and think with that as one kind of delineation between what an art historical perspective versus an art critical perspective can lend to this discussion. And at the same time, I'm also thinking about the way that Seth Rodney has written about the distinction between art criticism and arts journalism. And so again, I'm going to read at length, and then I want us to open this conversation up a bit so that it is actually a conversation. And so in the article, Art Criticism as a Way to Live, Rodney writes, "Journalism, in its ideal form, attempts to convey the facts of a situation, the who, what, when, where, and how that is talked about in level 1 journalism college courses. This is reportage. The journalist acts as a conduit for information that is verifiably true. Critics may also report facts, but they also offer an opinion, render a judgment. A critic takes reported information or reports it themselves and then interprets what it means for the individual, the community, the class, the nation. Criticism is both interpretive and analytical. It goes further than journalism by using analysis to establish historical genealogies, to theorize how the effects or ramifications of the reported thing might impact particular communities or have otherwise unforeseen impacts if circumstances change. Ultimately, criticism looks at meaning for the individual critic and for the public they address. The public part is indispensable. And I think I'm going to stop sharing there so we can get into a bit more of the conversation, because I'd like to make sure that we have space to talk about both our practices. TK and I both work as curators, but TK, you and I do very different kinds of arts writing alongside our curatorial practices. You write arts criticism and I do not. And we've talked about this extensively, but I thought that it would be great to get your perspective as somebody who's written arts criticism and knows some of the nuts and bolts behind the scenes of what it's like to produce this at the same time that we're both working in a landscape that is shaped by a history of this that we also have to contend with in our curatorial practice and our writing and scholarly practices.
Wow, that was fantastic. That was the most comprehensive. Wow. Like I'm super impressed. I just want to start by saying that. And I would say, it's something we had talked about previously, the distinctions between art historical writing, art journalism, and then art criticism are important even as they feed into each other. The Rhoden Project is completely dependent on all three forms of writing and feels most strongly the absence of that writing when it's not there, right? Like art historians are completely dependent on the work that journalists do on the ground, giving us that who, what, when, why, and where, that, critically received by, supported by, funded by, at this institution, at this date, when this institution existed at this location, the critical information that helps us locate the geographies, the cultural fabrics, the context that is necessary in order to actually analyze and start to create criticism, right? I need to know that Rhoden was showing in Black institutions and white institutions that he was being acquired. I need to know, if there was even press coverage, or if maybe there was a show where there ended up being no press coverage. It says so much about what that cultural meaning, the actual meaning that the work contributes to the larger meaning of what it means to be Black or a Black cultural products. I think for me, it's the hardest work to do all three because you're writing things that feed right into themselves. So but it's also beautiful in that you really understand the power of written word and how these words move and allow artists to, as has undergirded this conversation, slip out of public memory, slip out of being a household name. I think appearing in certain journals means, as we can all probably assess, it says something about a kind of artist. The kind of language that is used to describe an artist says something about an artist that changes how we feel about them, how seriously we take their art. And then for those thinking the longue durée, which, Brittany is like the person I would go to first if I was thinking long term. For people thinking of the longue durée, you are hungry and thirsty for criticism, because that criticism is what undergirds your value over years, over time. Someone's saying you are asking these questions, and these questions are significant because, and they continue to be relevant because it's invaluable to an artist. It's invaluable to a curator.
It is, and it shapes the research in such important ways. I mean, I think often about, what it is to read a journal article or, a clipping that notes, in Ebony magazine, for instance, that John Rhoden has done a commissioned sculpture for the new Afro-American Historical and Cultural Museum in Philadelphia, or for a journal to note that John Rhoden's work is on exhibition in Italy in a show that, you know, puts his work in context with other modernist sculptures. But I wonder, would a different kind of arts writing make for a different kind of public awareness of Rhoden's work and his reputation? And one of the things that we talked about in relationship to this is thinking about other generational examples. How are we thinking about the difference between the way we understand or don't see writing about Rhoden's work in context at the same time that somebody like Bearden or Jacob Lawrence is being written or talked about at the same time? And I was interested in your take on that, because I know that you have done a lot of, if I can get a bit meta here, like not just reviews of Bearden's work, but reviews of Bearden's work. And Bearden functioned in a really interesting way. Who, you know, he wasn't just an artist who was responsible for his own work. He was really institution building in a way that was really particular, not just with forming artist groups like Spiral, but producing a lot of scholarship, including, you know, this incredible biography, this overview of African American artists.
Uh, Dude, it is so difficult to talk about Romare Bearden because the benefit of looking out, scoping out historically is that you see them over decades, right? We see him evolve as an artist, going from expression extraction to the collage he would become famous for, telling stories about the South, and then becoming canonized by the larger art history. So I just want to distinguish that he is a perfect case study for this, because he existed in a time in the 20th century when Black artists were being segregated out of larger cultural institutions and not part of the conversation. Romare Bearden was one of the artists submitting work to Hale Woodruff's Atlanta Annuals at Atlanta University back in the day, when Black artists couldn't submit to other juried shows. And he was putting his work up against his peers, trying to win prizes that would then be collected by an institution, which I think is also a part of this longue durée. The prize winners would be collected by an institution, and now, for example, are going to be on view at the Met in the new Harlem Renaissance show that are opening. That's the kind of trajectory of longue durée that happens. But he also then goes ahead and pushes against that, right? And he ends up sending this very infamous letter to Atlanta University saying, I, as a Black artist, no longer only want to be seen with Black artists to prove that I'm the best. I have to be shown with the best. And so I'll no longer be participating in the Atlanta Annuals. This annual that he never won a prize in, mind you. He decides to push against that and then push for larger, wider audiences and wider critical acclaim. And he was fortunate enough to be consumed not only by similar ebony jet profiles, something over something else in the New Yorker, he was also written about critically and made space for himself to be written about critically and his peers. And so he existed in real time at the things that we would expect or need of him in terms of a building of ephemera in an archive. He was actively building himself in real time, which every artist could not do. And so we end up finding ourselves art historically relying on him and his words and his sketches of other artists, because he was doing that biographical art historical writing, not necessarily always critical. And now that he has been canonized by the larger art world, not just the Black art world that kind of sprung out of the Harlem Renaissance and just infiltrated all the rest. But as we talk about him as a canonized figure, books come out where we re-return, we re-remember, we reanalyze. And I've written a very negative review of a book about Bearden's work on the South, that the author I won't mention, but it's a terrible book. And it basically reinterprets his work from an older white woman's perspective from the same place, which is not an invalid way of it's not an invalid point of analysis. But what it does is it undoes all the work he did himself throughout the 20th century while he was alive. And I think that is the danger of the longue durée, when you can be reanalyzed and reanalyzed and reanalyzed again, so far away from the words that you wrote initially that weren't valued. And so that, I think, shows a consistent issue when it comes to specifically Black art criticism, Black art journalism, and Black art history. Are we actually valuing the work? or are we following trends in the market?
That's interesting. And it's also difficult, right? Because part of the, I feel like one of the luxuries I have in this current moment of not being responsible for producing art criticism is there's a way that you can privilege a kind of critical distance that comes from time. And I'm not somebody who thinks that distance and objectivity are the same thing. I often think that we flatten these two things together. And this is something that comes up in my analysis, my reading of other people's work. But I am interested in this idea that there can be a thing as too much distance and that we can get too far away from the work, this is the danger of the longue durée. And I'm wondering if part of what's happening in sort of reading a certain kind of, let's say, reading a text that reanalyzes an artist, is there's a bit of it's the burden of underrepresentation, right? This is part of the problem that in many cases, because there has not actually been a long history of art history that has engaged in Black artists, so that if there is such a subfield of art history that is Black art history, it hasn't had a long life. We aren't looking at hundreds of years of scholarship. The time frame to produce work that has been publicly shown in important institutional spaces, that has been seen by wide audiences, that has been in a position to be covered by journalists, by arts journalists, even just for basic documentation, and then engaged by art critics who will dive into the work in a different way. And then enough time being allowed to pass that art historians can then enter this conversation from the critical distance that is the distance of time, if not the distance of, social location like race or class or gender or geography. Because part of what we're talking about with Bearden is like this idea of reinterpreting not just Bearden's work as an artist, but understanding the very specific location of the American South. Does some of this actually, is some of this problem just the problem of the fact that this is an unfortunately young field, for lack of a better way of framing it?
I think young and undervalued and divided, because of that history of segregation. Audiences expect different things. I expect different things from the ephemera that I'm analyzing, right? And what you're going to be able to glean are going to be different. Thinking about Ebony and Jet and these historically Black publications that have a particular way of even engaging with art, right? Culture is more holistic in these publications. There is not just art. It's a Black man who creates art and travels the world and is, it's all of him. It's everything he is, because he is in that journal representing, to a certain extent, a presentation of Blackness that audiences at that time would want to consume. And of course, that has changed over time in Black publications. What audiences want and what they expect to consume has changed. And artists have, like Romary Bearden, come into their own and have started producing, David Driscoll, have started producing their own critical and foundational texts in art history. But to your point, it's so interesting to think of Black art history as circular instead of linear. And I think that that's important, because just like with the Rhoden show, we're filling in gaps that inform gaps that have not yet even been here. I think that to a certain extent, people will be looking to your exhibition, not only to learn about Rhoden and to learn about the slippages of art history and how we undergird these artists, but also how to build an archive. How to build an archive of a Black artist, how to conserve Black art made from these materials, how to understand Blackness globally, internationally. This is foundational work that's happening in real time for an artist that has been dead for years. And this is going to keep happening as we continue to rediscover, or I think sometimes for better word, revalue artists who have not necessarily had the same platform as a Romary Bearden or a Jacob Lawrence. I think the work you're doing is extremely important, and it is the full work. It's not just saying, hey, this Black artist existed, he did things, he was, traveling through Asia and Europe. You're also saying, and I'm going to preserve this work, and I'm going to continue to, encourage the study of this work, to make a platform and a foundational text, which is the value of the catalog, for continued critical analysis. And that's the longue durée work. That is what's so difficult, you know?
Yeah, and I'm wondering for you, is there a way that when you engage in various projects, um, curatorial projects, when you see exhibitions, because one thing you do when you're a curator and you work on exhibitions, you see far more exhibitions than you work on, and you have a really voracious and capacious exhibition visiting appetite. Like it's really impressive. And so I'm wondering if you think that the limits of the historical archive of art criticism in general, I mean, in general, I want to acknowledge that there is not enough arts criticism for artists that have been produced in the past period. This is not, I don't believe that we're necessarily in a field where all of the talent, all of the cream is going to rise to the crop. We are constantly in a field that has been sedimented by the fact that certain artists have been overlooked. Too many artists have been overlooked by major media outlets and minor media outlets. We're always hoping that we're just one more grad thesis away from discovering a story that we needed to know that changes our view of anything. And still, recognizing that, given that, do you think that the ways that we can look at the archival record for arts criticism and see the gaps, the lack of engagement of Black artists, is this a historic problem that extends into the present? Are you seeing this in the contemporary landscape of both, shows you're seeing that no one's reviewing, or art criticism you're reading that, is missing things, or that is engaging Black artists in ways that you think are unproductive, or are moving us in directions that just don't serve artists or readers well?
Oh, that is such a good question. Oh my gosh. And yes, all of the above. I mean, we're talking, for those in the audience, I understand that this might be a difficult conversation to follow because we're talking about these different branches of writing. And then we're also talking about a discipline, a canon. We're also talking about racism in building a discipline and a canon. And it's there's so much happening at once that leads to these slippages in time and recognition. And I think as a contemporary arts writer, critic, curator, I go out into the world. I pitched a show yesterday that was turned down. We have an issue that there aren't enough necessarily Black critics or critics with the cultural range to actually critically analyze work. So there's that issue. Then these publications aren't doing so hot financially. We're in a time where this is not the age of printed matter. We are struggling. Most publications are struggling to get people to purchase them, read them, value them. As someone who is a contributing editor at Art Papers, we are unfortunately sunsetting, and we're sunsetting at our 50th year. 50 years of art criticism, of good art criticism. I know I'm biased. I love Art Papers, but good art criticism. 50 years of an archive that is held at Emory, which we hope will reach art historians. This is the segregation and the siloing, right? What was published publicly is not necessarily always going to end up in art historical writing. These are different channels of discourse, different conversations that are happening. And again, we have different audiences. I try to pitch something, and what I pitch may be coming from a point that is not necessarily reaching the audience of a particular publication, but that publication has the circulation that I need as a writer to get an artist's voice out there. Some publications, if an editor can't see the value of a particular artist, they won't necessarily accept pitches. Just because you see a show not getting reviewed doesn't mean a writer's not pitching that show, doesn't mean that people aren't critically trying to get to it. And the world is getting so much smaller. I travel quite a bit, and every time I see a show, it's a tragedy. I see something beautiful and it's in its last 2 days. It closes tomorrow. No publication will take that review because they like to, there's a push to have reviews come out at the beginning so people go see the thing. It's not necessarily a value of the writing or the critical thought itself. It's about pushing people into the actual space, which as a curator I value. But as a critical arts writer, how can the show happen again unless we magnify it? How can we continue to put resources in the hands of those curators or that institution or those artists unless we magnify it? And then there's the reality of how much writers are paid, and or how little writers are paid, or how little control they have over their own words, and how a lot of writers have to push to share copyright of their writing. There's so many factors that lead to it's not coming out, on top of so many factors that lead to why we see so much press of some shows and some artists, and then the real reality of the market, and the market pushing certain artists to the fore, and the market allowing for certain galleries to pay for more space in a printed publication that takes up more space, that then pushes back on those artists who aren't represented by a gallery, or those artists who aren't necessarily being presented in huge, well-supported, well-resourced institutions. And then there's the cachet and the lack of cachet of each institution. Some institutions will have a review just because it is the Met, the Whitney, the Brooklyn Museum. And some institutions are overlooked because they exist in flyover states. There's a lot of factors, but I think the most important factor is the lack of resources for, and the lack of value for, critical arts writing. And I would say and I don't know if you were thinking about this as you were creating and editing this catalog, inviting writers into the space, that again, the most important thing that an art historian can do, right? Because it's like passing a baton. I as the art journalist am saying the who, what, when, why, and where, passing the baton to the critical writer who's saying this art matters in this time because, who then passes the baton to the curator art historian who canonizes the artist. Were you thinking about that process as you were creating this catalog, and thinking about the kind of critical writing that can come from it in the future?
I appreciate that question. The answer is both yes and no. So I think as a reader, producing a catalog, as somebody who likes to read a lot of catalogs, I was thinking a lot about the consumer. And so knowing that as both a producer of research and a consumer of research, I always appreciate and would say, oh, thank you. It's just sort of like up out into the universe every time I encountered something that was useful in the archive, that was either doing journalistic work or critical work, because this is how we correct a historic gap. So in that sense, yes. And in the other sense, I think this thinking about the different importances of, the arts journalism that is documentary, the criticism that gives us a read on both the way that work was received in its contemporary moment, but also what that reveals about a particular kinds of art critic or an art writer. I was also thinking about what that lends to this conversation, because if you are in the practice of reading a lot of art criticism, you do get used to a particular writer's voice and a particular writer's sensibilities. There are writers that we know as soon as we see their name on the byline, we have some sense of what we're going to be getting into, because we know what kinds of things they like to review, ways that they like to write about work. You get attached to writers if you read them often. But I do think that the exhibition catalog has to do a different kind of work for an artist and for an audience if history has not done that work for them. And so what I appreciate about you offering this contribution to thinking about what it takes to produce art criticism is this reveal behind the scenes that answers the question of, why don't we see more arts writing about X, Y, or Z? I don't think that there's often space where in these conversations where we're thinking about our historical legacy or our historical importance, or the difference between cultural value or intellectual value or market value, which are things that I always like to untangle. I don't think that we always have a lot of conversation around, what is, if we take for granted that arts writing will exist, that's an incredibly dangerous way not to understand, well, who is producing this art writing and what's happening with them? So what are you all having to learn and be savvy about when you when you pitch a particular show to a publication and are trying to make the case that this is important to write about, or this is important for your readers to know about, even if it's an exhibition that, you know, isn't going to close immediately, that does have a length of time. And what I'm thinking with, as I ask this question, and I hope our participants are getting their questions ready, but I'm anticipating the question that I have gotten from artists, living artists often, which is, you know, why aren't there more of you writing about us?
Oh, I just want to say thank you for that. And also, writing is a labor, y'all. Like, truly investing in your work for all the artists out there, like, it is a labor. I take your work seriously. And when it's bad, oh, this is something I didn't get to say. Also, there's a real negative push against negative criticism. You know, there's a lot of critics out there who, unfortunately, all they have the time to write is a negative review, and they're brilliant and they're sharp and they're helpful. Sometimes they're just cruel, and you don't need that. Sometimes they're just short-sighted. But sometimes negative criticism is the thing that pushes it. Just like you have this beautiful historical example of Rhoden laminating this piece of criticism that isn't necessarily glowing. You know, like, that is critical to an artist's practice as they think about how their objects move in the world outside of them. That is part of the reciprocal call and response that is making art for an audience. When you lose that and you're just allowed to just deploy objects out into the world any kind of way, and art criticism cannot afford to support negative criticism, you just have this kind of toxic positivity that happens, or flattening of the work. You can't talk about it critically in a negative way. So you just have to say as much positive where the positive is, or even reduce it down to the who, what, when, why, and where, because an editor or a publication will not take that negative review. That is a real thing that we're working against. When there's a lot of language around criticism being care, and I think that is particularly important in marginal communities. You know, thank goodness for social media, right? We see in real time conversations that used to happen around a coffee table, conversations that used to happen in someone's living room. Brittany has been to my living room, and we've had conversations critically analyzing shows, critically talking about even a particular kind of argument that a curator takes. You know, I stopped a colleague the other day at the High and said, you know, I've seen the Hear Me Now show that's up, the show that shows Dave the Potter, in relation to contemporary artists like Simone Lee. I saw it in Boston, I saw it at the Met, and now I've seen it at the High. Each show was completely different and does something completely different for their geographies. Would anybody take a review of that? Absolutely not. But I think it's important, one, for audiences to understand when a show gets to your venue, it's changed. It changes. There are sometimes different objects, there are different didactics, there's different languages that the curators use, trying to make it more relevant to you. Or, you know, it completely changes how you intake the art. I thought the only great presentation of the show was at the MFA Boston. One, because they made the work reverent in a way that is personally important to me. Dave the Potter is a reverent figure. He's not just a crafts person. He's not just an artist. He's not just a historical figure. He is culturally important. And the show framed that even in its very design. And that is something I can, you know, sit at the coffee table with Brittany and say, like, girl, you got to understand, when they painted those walls cranberry, it resonated in a way that I don't think people can understand. Even the idea of putting Black art on white walls is still, you know, it's still a choice. You know, the cultural range and specific knowledge and experiences you need to curate Black art, to show Black art, to create Black art, needs to be in dialogue with Black people. And, and yes, that limits sometimes who can write about what or what can be written about when. But when there is space and resource made for that, which is unfortunately still very rare, but when there is space and resource made for that, the most beautiful criticism is produced, right? Like, and Twitter revealed to us that that criticism is happening all the time. It's just not being published in print, which means when that Twitter is deleted because of, some for whatever reason, all of that criticism is gone. It just lives in us, which continues that cycle of gaps in art history. I've seen scholars have brilliant discourse on Instagram comments. And unfortunately, those Instagram comments don't get to translate to a New York Times feature. And the valuing of those are completely culturally different. If that makes sense.
It does make sense, because part of what I really love about, even just this example of seeing the Hear Me Now exhibition, which I've dropped a link to in the chat, just for, for folks who are in the Atlanta area and might be looking for an exhibition to see. It's at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. I think there's also this one, I have seen some great discourse in the comment section of a particular kind of Instagram post, even that I would call critical discourse, where people are talking about the experience of seeing an exhibition of an artist's work and having a different experience of that work, or receiving that work differently because of where they saw it. And I often think that that is the kind of, I see a comment from my colleague, Dr. Anna Marley, that Panorama, the art journal, would take a comparative review of an exhibition. And I think that that's the kind of conversation that has been enjoyable to have in person with colleagues, but also that I have seen on social media when someone says, oh, when somebody posts, an image of an exhibition that they have a critique of, and you watch somebody have a counterpoint because they saw that work in a different location, and so that made them see it in a different way, or that made them see the artist's work in a different way. I think that the benefit of having that in a place as public and accessible as social media is that occasionally an artist might actually see that that's a conversation that's happening around that work, if we're doing this about a contemporary artist's work. And I think it's valuable to have that kind of context for an artist to see, oh, my work actually looks different in this location versus this location, or installed at this height versus this height. Readers, viewers actually understand my work or misunderstand my work because of this particular kind of framing, because it was installed against this wall color. We have argued endlessly about wall colors in exhibitions, or because it was installed at this height, or because it was narrated in a particular way, or because the curatorial framing was something that did this kind of work or undid this kind of work for an artwork. And what I appreciate about this is that it reminds us that artwork is not produced in a vacuum, and it's not consumed in a vacuum. And so every space where you encounter it affects what it is that you think you're able to see or understand about the work. And so I see that we're at 12:50, and I'd like to open this up for Q&A. So as people are getting their questions ready, I wanted to ask you about teaching. What I often think about when I read historic art criticism, either in an archive or in an old journal or an old newspaper, versus the arts criticism that I read now in this contemporary moment, where there are plenty of people who are constantly doing reviews of exhibitions that we all sort of read, regardless of how we feel about them, because you're sort of supposed to read that. You see Roberta Smith, or you see Jerry Saltz, or you see, there are certain things that pop up, and regardless of whether or not you're actually even interested in the review, it's like, oh, I want to see a person's take, or I want to see this kind of deep dive into, whatever this is, just to have a sense of what the conversation is. How does that impact your teaching, and what does it make you think about arts critical writing, both the teaching of arts critical writing as a practice, as in how do you teach people to write art criticism, and as a reading practice? I can remember, you and I had a conversation about Bell Hooks' Art on My Mind, as an arts critical text that is really valuable to teach.
Absolutely. I mean, when I teach, I used to teach. I was a visiting lecturer at Cornell in their art and architectural planning program, and I taught a course on cultural criticism where Bell Hooks's book was first and foundational. Art on My Mind is good Black art criticism. It's so good. And it's not just good because everything she says is right. It's good because it's a book you can argue with. And I think that that is something that students, especially in higher education, need to understand. Discourse is about being able to respond and push the conversation forward. It's not about just consuming information. And I would say the same about critical writing. I don't write anything that I don't think can be pushed back against. You need to, I want a response. I want people to be in conversation with me. And I also want people of differing identities to tell me, well, actually, in my culture, this means this, or this color means this, or this made me feel like this, or this language has excluded me because of this. You know, I want that. That it's to build, not necessarily to tear apart, right? You make space. And Bell Hooks's Art on My Mind does this beautiful job of blending together her interviews, her personal essays about her own life and engagements with art, her own experiences working with artists, and then shows she'd seen, materials that she's in, the use of blood. You know, it's just a good book of criticism. And what I think is interesting is that it's not necessarily considered an art historical text. She's not interested in building a canon necessarily. She's not interested in supporting the canon or filling gaps in the canon. She's just interested about having critical conversations about Black culture. And I teach artists. You know, I was teaching undergraduate artists who may not end up artists, or may end up very serious artists, or may end up architects, or may end up, you know, anything, but they're trying to have serious conversations about what life as an artist might mean. And the foundational thing I like to teach them is, regardless of, you know, if you become a famous artist, if you're an artist who only shows in your living room, that object that you made, or that image that you made, or that material that you showed us all the elasticity of, is going to exist out in the world, and it's going to impact somebody. And if it's positive or if it's negative, you are responsible for that impact. You have done this. You've made somebody's day. You've shown someone a new way of understanding beauty. You've made someone cry. You have made someone see themselves on a wall in a gallery that they would never go to before. And for people of marginal identities, women artists, queer artists, that is significant, because we have access, we have a right to culture as well. And not only do we have a right to it, we have a right to produce it, and we have a right for it to be valued. And that's a longer, even longer conversation that again loops back to that baton. Who has the baton at what time? Who's passing it at what time, and to who? And who's making sure that it gets to the art book, that it gets to the publisher? You know what I mean? That it gets to the canon, that it gets to the that the work is acquired. It's all and that's why I like it, the idea of it being circular. It's constantly happening at once. And the hope is that the person who needs to see that artwork, regardless of time or geography or space, sees it, and it impacts them, and they continue to produce new things. And so when it comes to teaching cultural criticism, it's not so much about writing criticism, it's about understanding how criticism empowers or disempowers an artist. And that, I think, you know, every artist should understand, because criticism is just, it's the response to the call. You know, and I think it's significant. If you're putting objects in the out in the world, you have to understand that people are going to respond. That was a long answer.
Oh, it was amazing, TJ. I so admire your work and all you bring into the world. Thank you both so much. And I think people are feeling it as well in the chat. I just wanted to give an opportunity to people who might have questions or comments, because I feel like the comments have been just as rich, and I feel like people have a lot to add. Anybody out there, just you could unmute yourself or raise your hand. I'd be happy to or put it in the chat. Okay, Abby, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi. Thank you, TK and Brittany, so much for such a wonderful conversation. I wanted to return to this point, TK, that you raised about like the siloing of these different art writings between like art history and art criticism and art journalism. And I'm wondering if you could meditate on why you, or wait, but for both of you, why you believe that is, because I think about literature, for instance, and like they have LA Review of Books, and there are scholars who contribute to this public writing on a regular basis, and it's public writing. And I'm wondering what, I mean, we have like our history has hyperologic nowadays, but I'm just wondering what you think it is that contributes to the siloing and how moving forward, how you feel that these disciplines and these writings can merge and communicate with one another more.
Brittany, you want me to start, or you want to start?
I think you should start. You have a bit more of the behind the scenes experience with this.
Thank you, Abby, for that question. I think it's really about the valuing of a particular kind of writing and thought that can be communicated through writing. We assume that journalism is the easiest, right? It's the easiest, it's supposed to be the most accessible, it's the most reproduced, and it's on the most easily biodegradable paper. Like there is a particular kind of understanding of journalism that sometimes even feels dirty, right? It's like, oh, the person with the, Rita Skeeter, and if you're Harry Potter fans, like things like that. And then there's this ivory tower valuing of criticism and art history as academic disciplines that everybody does not have access to an academic library where you can access archives as well as a slew of curated scholarship. And that limitation is delineated by class, resource, accessibility. And I think to dismantle that a little bit, one, I think social media is doing a great job of showing us that many people can have many, many beautiful discourses over many platforms, but also it is a powerful journalist who can just skirt over all of those different forms of writing and really communicate with audiences. I want to naively say, like, a good piece of journalism when you read it. You just know it because it's accessible and it's engaging, but it also just communicates just as much critical thought and just deep thought. Brittany.
Yeah, I love that you were doing the thing that you often do, which is to say a powerful thing that I strongly disagree with. I don't think that it's always the case that a good piece of journalism when you read it. I think that I think any kind of writing can be deceptive. I think that part of what's interesting about the siloing is, I do think that it is a problem that we think that it's easier to produce arts journalism and harder to produce arts criticism or art history. Even just like the materiality of the paper. I'm also thinking about like the cost of a newspaper or a newspaper subscription versus a journal or a journal subscription, that's part of it. But there's also a different kind of expectations of readers. And so I know that some of this siloing is about the expectation that newspaper readers want to see a particular thing, and they're different people than whoever picks up an art journal. And wants to read an article. And that's a different person than somebody who wants to read art criticism of an exhibition that is maybe trying to understand how to think differently about an artist that they already know well or like well, or a subject matter that they like, and is maybe just looking for information on what they should go see, which is another kind of way to read work, but is a different kind of reading. I think that silo question is a really, really big one that I'd like to think more about. But there's a part of me that wants to sort of hold space for both the problem of the silo and what's happening in these containers that aren't sort of spilling out across other spaces. Because I've definitely read things in art journals that I thought, oh, I wish that this were in a more accessible outlet because this is so interesting and so rich and so powerful. It would be interesting to a wider swath of people than whoever is going to pick up, this journal that I'm encountering at a conference or on, in an academic database search. And at the same time, I also, again, back to your point about the print media industry, you also know that there is a class of editors, there people imagine that writers and curators are the like gatekeepers of the art world, but they're gatekeepers for all of us also. And so I know that part of what maintains these silos is, editorial boards and publishing houses and sometimes corporate conglomerates. So if we're talking about who owns, newspapers, that silo is maintained by people in positions of power who get to decide what does and doesn't get published, even if it results in squashing something that would be really culturally valuable. The audience doesn't know that there's this thing that would have been amazing that didn't get to see the light of day.
Oh, there are some good questions in the chat, but unfortunately we are at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. And this is an unmatched, unbelievably rich conversation. Thank you so much, Brittany and TK. Incredible conversation. I can't wait to get this online because I think a lot of people are going to want to share it and watch it again. Please join us again on March 6th for our next Art at Noon. It's going to be another amazing conversation. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thanks, y'all. Take good care.